For a change of pace today, we're going to do a little bit of Yalkut Bi'urim, which we haven't done in a while. And it's actually on page Hey. And the reason why it's only page K is because we're on volume 2 of the Masechet, which we just started a few days ago. So really towards the very beginning of this particular volume. Now, just to start with an easy departure, an easy takeoff, we'll mention that our sugya here on Daf Chafam Beis addresses the issue of chayve lavin in Yibum, meaning that Ruvain, the deceased, had been married to a woman who is chayve lavin either to he himself and he violated that Isur, or at least she'd be chayve lavin to Shimon. Like, for example, let's say Shimon was appointed the Kohen Gadol, and he has a brother named Ruvain, who was a Kohen, but he wasn't the Kohen Gadol. In any event, Ruvain was married to Sarah, and Ruvain died childless, and now Sarah falls to Yibum in front of the Kohen Gadol. And the Torah says that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry an almana, and every case of Yibum, by definition, is an almana. Now, we're not sure, and that's what Rava vacillates about. Jeff, were you here yesterday? I forget. Yeah. So I'm just reviewing what, you heard this from me 50 times already, but Rava is vacillating about Esei Docha Losas, that the mitzvah of Yibum should override the Lotas, in this case, of Almana L'Kohen Gadol, or for that matter, Mamzeres, Nesina, all the other cases that we mentioned. Now, Rav is not sure about it because Yibum is a little bit of a complicated case. It has a catch-22 because the Torah allowed for chalitza. So you can simply have your cake and eat it, as we called it. You can fulfill what the Torah demands without having to violate the Isur Lav through Bia with Isur Lavan because you gave her chalitza. So the bottom line is, it's not clear at all whether or not the principle of Esei Docha Losa would apply in Yibum, given the option of Chalitza. Assuming right now, let's go through the stage 1 in the Sugya, Rav assumes that we do apply Esei Docha Losa. And we don't opt for Chalitza. However, there are Banan prohibited. As far as Torah law is concerned, Yibum would apply, Yibum would override the Lav. It doesn't override a chiv kares in the case of the 15 arayos listed at the beginning of the Masechta, but it does override an Isur Lav, but the Rabbanan prohibit. Now, why would the Rabbanan do so? If you recall what we discussed yesterday, I'm mentioning, so Mitchell, filling you in, is that we're afraid that he, when he marries, let's say Shimon, when he is Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum with Chayve Lavin, the essay will only be able to be Docha the Lotas on the first Bia, but not on the second Bia. And we're afraid that if we allow the first Bia, he might come to be a Shnia, which would be a violation of the law. So that's what you'll see here on the top of this page. Hey, Ela Marava, Gzera Bia Rishona Atu Bia Shnia. Kasu Atosius, Shalav Dafka Bia Shnia Asura Min Torah. When we put a hold on Esei Docha Losa, it's not just from Bia Rishona to Bia Shnia, because there's no Esei in Bia Shnia, but even within Bia Rishona itself, we have to put a hold on Esei Docha Losa. Now, why is that so? Because we split Bia into two parts. There's Tchilas Bia and there's Sof Bia, or Gmar Bia. And miyad d'tchilas habiyah far kiem es mitzvasa. The premise here that Tosfos is operating with, we'll see this is going to come under a great contention, but Tosfos lays down a premise that to be kona his Yevamot, all he needs is tchilas biyah. And if you get graphic about it, if he would withdraw before he finishes his biyah, he would have already have been kona her as a full-fledged Eishes Ish and have fulfilled his mitzvah of Yibum. But he didn't do that, or he might not do it. And instead, he continues to the finish line, if you pardon the phrase, and that's Gemar Biyah. So now what happens is that you cannot apply Esi Dochalot, says Tosfos, within that very first Biyah. Why? Because the Kiyama mitzvah, when he's Kona, is with Chilas Biyah. But then he finishes his Biyah and he's violating the law, but there's no longer an essay to be Docha the Lotus. And therefore, the Gemara could have, we could sort of reformulate the Gemara's answer that Gozu Chachamim B'Yibum Chayvilavim Tchilas Biyah Otu Sof Biyah. That if we allow him to do Tchilas Biyah, he might do Sof Biyah. If I was a betting man, I would say he will do Sof Biyah. And that's a violation of Allah. Aval Harishonim, even though Tosfos is of this opinion, he's got a long list of the Rishonim. I call them Chachmei Sfarad or Chachmei Provence, as opposed to the Ashkenazic Tosfos. Kosvu Sha'af Gmar Biyah Mutim in Torah b'Chai Bilav. Even Gmar Biyah is mutim. Now, how could that be? Are the Rishonim denying that Tchilas Biyah is enough to be Kona the Yevamot? The Afal Gav Shemisha She'era Ba. That's called Tchilas Biyah. It's called Hara. Is Kana? He was Kona her. Mikamakom Yechno LeMitzvah Ad Gmar Biyah. We thought that the mitzvah terminates with the kinyan. She became a full-fledged Eishes Ish, and that was his mitzvah. To upgrade Zika of Yibum to Eishes Ish, and that he did. And nobody's denying that he was Kona her as an Eishes Ish. So why in the world do the Chachmei Sfarad consider that the Gemar Biyah, even after he was Kona her, is also part of the mitzvah? The Yeshno mitzvah Gemar Biyah. The Rishonim say, let's read the pasuk. We go back to scriptures. It says, Yavama Yavo Oleh. What does that mean, Yavo Oleh? That's his mitzvah as a Yavam. V'chein lahakim shem li achiv. Eino miskayim el v'gemar biyah. The mitzvah is not kinyan. Although we agree that the kinyan was clinched with hara, with tchilas biyah. But the mitzvah is full-fledged biyah. And not only that, lahakim shem li achiv, that's possible only with gmar biyah, meaning the possibility of her becoming impregnated so that we could be making shem li achiv is dependent upon gmar biyah, cannot be achieved with chilas biyah. That's what the Rishonim said. El shariba kosef af hara. Although it's true that even hara would be considered biyah as far as kinyanim is concerned, but in the specific case that's under our surveillance here, on that study, namely Yibum, the mitzvah of Yibum requires gmar biyah. Just a comment on the side, I was very excited by the conclusion of the Rishonim, but I was disappointed in the logic and the reasoning of the Rishonim. I thought the reason was because in order to say essay Dokalosa said, you want to define the essay, we look at the Maisa, and we don't divide it up into its minuscule parts, into its smallest segments. Look at the entire Maisa. But they seem to be saying something else. We're not going to define, we're not going to look at the entire Maisa, we're going to look at the Kiyama mitzvah, But in the case of Yibum specifically, and when you derive this from Psukim, the Kiyama mitzvah is suspended until he finishes the Gemara. Okay, now he introduces the Rashba. Al Pishi Tasam, Ochichu Arishonim, but at the head of the list is the Rashba. Misugyan, Afshe Kedushe Bia Konim Rak Bigmar Bia, Mishum Shekol Boel Daito Al Gmar Bia, Mikol Makom Yibum Kone Bitchilas Bia. Okay, now we'll have to explain why, but let's first see the mathematical conclusion of the Rashba without even understanding why. The Rashba says that in our sugya, where the gzera was bia rishona or to be a shniya, but there was no gzera within bia rishona, then it means, says the Rashba, that the kinyan was completed with chilas bia. But as far as Esei Dochalosa said, the balance of the bia, the Gemar bia, is necessary and critical in the Kiyuma mitzvah. Again, this is a brisket tzvei bia, but from the time way before Reb Chaim. We're going back 8 centuries before Reb Chaim. There are 2 dimensions to Yibum. There's the kinyan, making her into an Eshes Ish, and there's the mitzvah. And the Rishonim are saying that the difference between these 2 dimensions is actually a time difference. There's a sequence here. Because the kinyan dimension that makes her into an Eshes Ish is clinched at time T1, which is Tchilas Bia. But the mitzvah is suspended until Gemar Bia at time T2. So the Rashba says, you see clearly that the kinyan is chal, according to all these Rishonim, with Chilas Bia. And that's against the Gemara in Kiddushin. Because the Gemara in Kiddushin, when it goes through, it's the first 10 blot of Masechet Kiddushin goes through Kesev, Shtar, until on Daf Yud Aleph it gets to Bia. And the Gemara establishes with regard to Bia that the Kiddushay Bia, if he opts for that method, are suspended until Gmar Bia, because Kol HaBoel, Kol HaMakadesh, Daito Al Gmar Bia. Kol HaBoel, Daito Al Gmar Bia. So we have to come to the following mathematical conclusion without understanding the reasoning behind it, that Kiddushin and Yibum are 2 separate halachas. Whereas in Kiddushin, Kol HaBoel Daito Al Gmar Bia, and therefore the Chalos Kinyan is suspended and pushed off until Gmar Bia. But with regard to Yibum, the Kinyan is Chal with Chilas Bia. We're still going to apply Esei Dochalosa because the mitzvah, which we derive from the pasuk of Yavo Aleha and Lahakim Shem Liachiv, that's suspended until Gmar Bia, but the Kinyan was already Chal with Chilas Bia. Tosas thought that if the kinyan is chal b'tchilas bia and yibum, then the mitzvah is clinched and completed with tchilas bia. Rishonim disagree. They say that no, the mitzvah requires what? Gemar bia, not just tchilas bia. But kuliyamalo pligi in this sugya that the kinyan was clinched with tchilas bia. That's against the Gemara in Kiddushin. We have to conclude that Kiddushin and Yibum are 2 separate halachas. Now go figure out why. He says, Mishum shayibum eino tolui b'daito, ela kone afilu bal karcha. So if I were to ask you the 5 questions, I'm quizzing you like you were elementary school students, you'll be moichel, right? I'm just for the sake of making a point. In the light of this last line of the Rashba, let's go back to the Gemara in Kiddushin that he quoted, Kol HaBoel Daito Al Gmar Bia. which word, if you had to underline or bold one word out of that entire phrase, in this context, which one should be bold? I'm going to read it again. Kol haboel daito al gmar bia. Which word do you want to highlight? Daito. And here's what the Rashba is saying, that the contrast between Kedushin and Yibum lies in the word daito. In Kedushin, everything depends upon daito. But Yevama is balkarcha, and there's no requirement of das. Now, when you say there's no requirement of das, I mean, he has to be aware of the fact that he's doing a ma'aseh bia. But his bia is not a kinyan like any other kinyan. All kinyanim, whether it's in Dinei Mamedes or in Kedushin, is always midaita. And then we have to ask, what was his das? Like, for example, the Gemara is going to talk about a case where they didn't do a shuma. Let's say they didn't evaluate the value of a certain what's called Shavah Kesef, and he thought it was worth X, and he finds out it's worth Y, and therefore it's not. He doesn't have das for Kedushin. And a similar halacha would be in Mekach Memkar. I thought I was selling you, $10 worth of barley, and it turns out it was $20 worth of barley. I would have charged double if I would have known. These are all sorts of halachas and das. Every kinyan requires das. There are actually two halachas. There's a das makna and a das konen. Meaning the das of the person who is transferring ownership, and the das of the person who is acquiring ownership. But das is the key word. If I had to, take one word and write it in big bold letters, it would be das. Yevama is not das. Again, he has to know, he has to be aware of the fact that he's doing a ma'aseh bia, but he doesn't have to know that with this bia, he is marrying this. He just has to set up a ma'aseh bia, which requires kavanah, but doesn't require das. Das means, well, I understand the repercussions, or I didn't understand, therefore there's no das. All that is unnecessary. So I'm going to ask you a question, you're going to laugh at. What happens if I whisper into the ears of a Yavam that by having a relationship with this Yavama, you know what I mean by relationship, I mean a ma'aseh bia, he will divorce her. Like he's saying goodbye to her. The opposite of a kinyan kedushin, of a kinyan interest. He goes ahead and he has be'ila with her, with the Yavama. And his das was that he's divorcing her. That this is the end of, our relationship. I'll give you one going away present, one birthday present for Yibum, and Gegezutei. Go ahead and get married to someone else. What would you say is her status? He's married. He's yelling and screaming. What are you talking about? He's married. I didn't want to marry this woman. I wanted to divorce this woman. Let's send her out. But the Torah says, Yevama Yavaleh. You just have to do the bia. That's all we need. You could jug it. There's nothing in your brain. In Kedushin, for example, if you would tell Reuven to have bia with Leah, and in that way she's a free agent, that would not be Kedushin, because you need das. Das means he has to be aware of the repercussions, what we call the chalos, that is a result of his Kedushin. But in Yibum, all he has to do is have kavanah for the ma'aseh bia. And here's the nafkamina. When it comes to Kedushay bia, we have a principle called a boel, daito, again, emphasize the word daito, al gmar bia. But with regard to Yibum, we don't have that principle because there's no requirement of das. And therefore, all we need is a ma'aseh bia. Now, in the Torah's view, in the Torah perspective, legally, what constitutes a ma'aseh bia? Do I need tfilas bia and sof bia, or tfilas bia is sufficient? And what's the answer? Tfilas bia is sufficient. So, for example, if a man, chas shalom, has a bia with an erva, with Edom and Asra and all that, he'll be chayev for Tchilas Bia. We don't care whether he does Gemara Bia or not. And therefore, in the case of Yibum, with Tchilas Bia, which constitutes legally a Bia, he is Kona, and she becomes an Ashes Ish with Tchilas Bia, which is against the principle of Kedushin of Kalabal Bait Kal Gemara Bia, but because in Kedushin we have Allah of Das. But here, in Yibum, we don't have a requirement of Das, and therefore all we need is a Ma'aseh Bia. What qualifies as a Ma'aseh Bia? Tchilas Bia. When does he actually fulfill the mitzvah according to the Chachmei Sfarad? Only with Gemara Bia, but as far as the Kinyan issues, to make her into an Ashes Ish, that is completely clinched when he does a Ma'aseh Bia, which is a legal concept, and a Tchilas Bia is enough for a Ma'aseh Bia. His Das was a Gemara Bia, we don't care about your Das. If we were to beat up the Yavam till he's black and blue, to force him to do a Bia with his Yevama, if there was such a case, again, there's always Chalitza as an option, but in a theoretical world, he would be Konar as an H's totally against his will. He's yelling and screaming. I don't know how he's going to perform the Bia. That's a different question. He says, Mishum Sha'yibum, it pays to underline these words. It's the second paragraph, third line. Mishum Sha'yibum Eino Toli B'daita. Elakona Afilu Bal Karchim. She'im Lokein Madua Pshita Leila Gemara. Oh, now the Rashba invokes a proof. Let's see if we can figure out his proof. Pshita La Gemara. Shalmana mina erisim uteres mina tor l'kohen gadol mishum she'esei docha lo saver mitchilas bia he nasis be'ula u'begemara bia kfar asur la belav shel almana u'bi esei shel be'ula ve'ein esei docha lo sasevi esei. Here's the cash, and this question is going to serve as a proof to the Rashba that in Yibum he's Kona b'tchilas bia. Gemara makes the following distinction. So, Mitch, you have to clue in on this because we talked about this. I don't think you were here. In the case of Almana l'kohen gadol, it's really, really tricky. Why? Because you're going to tell me, right, Ruvain's married to Sarah, he dies without children, Shimon is the Kohen Gadol. So you're going to tell me, yes, they don't chalosas, right? The Gemara says it's just Gzera D'Rabbanan in the original. So the Gemara says it depends. Did Ruvain, the late Ruvain, consummate his marriage with Sarah with chuppah, which is called Nesuin, or did Ruvain die? You know, in the old days, it was a year separating Erison from Nesuin, and during that year, Nebuch has gestorben. She is a Basula. Now, what's the difference? The Torah, with regard to Kohen Gadol, has both a lav and an esek, but there's a fundamental difference between the two. Whereas the lav applies to every almana, even almana min ha'erisim. The essay of hu b'psulei yikaf doesn't apply to every single almana. It only applies to almana min ha'nesuin, where we assume that after the chuppah they had bia, and she's there for ba'ula. Okay. So now the premise is that if Reuven, the late Reuven, only got to Erison before he died, then as far as Shimon the Kohen Gadol is concerned, we would apply the principle of Esei Dochalos. Why? Because since there was never Nesuin on the part of Reuven, she is Becheskas B'sula. And we only have a Losaseh of Almana Lo Yikak. We don't have the Esei, so we don't say Ein Esei Dochalos. The Esei Dochalos. Says the Rashba, I don't get it. The essay is fulfilled with Chilas Bia. At that point, she becomes a Ba'ula. And therefore, the Gemar Bia would be a losa seviesa. How could you say that since she's an almana mina erison, therefore I can apply the principle of essay don't chalosa because it's only a losa without an essay? That's not true, because gemar bia, she's already ba'ula at that point. Why? Because the Torah recognizes tchilas bia as a bia. We said, for example, in our riots. But here's another example: when you want to transform the status of a basula to that of ba'ula, all you need is tchilas bia. By the way, that could have repercussions theoretically again as far as ksuba is concerned. A ksuba of a ba'ula is different than a ksuba of a basula. Half the price. And if she had ha'ara, which means tchilas bia, she's already a ba'ula. But it's more important here as far as the Raisa halacha of Kohen Gadol. Is there a violation of the essay of Hu B'Sula? And the answer is that she was a B'Sula during the tchilas bia, but not in sof bia. And therefore, we should not be able to apply essay. The Gemara assumes we can apply essay to halosas in the case of almana min ha'erison. That's not true, because once she became a be'ula midway through the be'ila, if you could do the be'ila in slow motion, right at that point, cut it down the middle, and at that point she became a be'ula. Now the self bia is not just a violation of a lotus; it's a lotus and an essay. So how can you apply essay to halosas? But the answer must be, says the Rashba. So wait a minute. So what is the answer? Just one second. Madu pshitile the Gemara shal mana mina erisim uteretz mina Torah legoyim gadol mitzvah do falosas hare betchilas bia hinasis beula gemar bia kfar asol belav shal mana ubiasi shal beula v'eresi do falosas. Just one second. A minute. I'm missing one little piece here. You just have to understand in locain, those three words in locain. If you're going to what, and what are we saying here? That the Kenyan was Ham Tchilas Bia. Oh, I got it. I think I got it. Let's see. The prohibition of almana l'kohen gadol comes under lo yikach. Marriage. He's not allowed to marry a ba'ula. He's not allowed to marry an almana. In the case of an almana min erison, it's only a lav. In the case of almana min anasuin, he is enjoined with both a lav and an es. If you're going to apply the principle of Kiddushin, if you're going to, let me say it this way, if you're going to assume an analogy, an equation between Kiddushin and Yibum, that just like in Kiddushin, when is she Mekudeshes? And the answer is only with Gemar Bia, and you'll apply that same rule, that same yardstick to Yibum, then you're in deep trouble. Because his Kiddushin, his Ishus, in the case of Almana l'kohen gadol, Almana min erison, is only going to be Chal with Gemar Bia, because you've now assumed an equation between Kiddushin and Yibum. Well, I got news for you, buddy. When you get to Gemar Bia, she's already a Ba'ula, and you got a problem of Ein Esi Don't V'lo Seviesi. So what did you gain by Almana min erison? But, says the Rashi, if you agree with my premise, that there's a difference fundamentally between Kiddushin on the one end and Yibum on the other. Whereas in Kiddushin, he's only Konar, and she becomes an ancient seat with Gemar Bia. But in Yibum, all you need is Tchilas Bia. Now I understand why for the Sof Bia, I don't even need Esei Don Chalosa. Forget it. She's already his wife. What Losa said can you talk about? The only Lota says marrying. Well, he already married her, and she was completely married to him with Tchilas Bia. Amazed to me that the Rishonim, going back to the Rashba, like 1,000 years ago.
So the fact that
Barcelona,
that the Kohen Gadol is the one who transformed her into the Ba'ula because it was him.
correct. I mean, otherwise, how could how could a Kohen Gadol marry anybody? You're not saying, you're going to tell me, oh, here's a Basula, go marry her. Well, you make her into a Ba'ula. But the answer is you make her into Ba'ula after the Kedushin. So once she's Mekudeshes, then there's no Isa, because the Isa is to be Makadish of Ba'ula. He was Makadish of Basula. But here says the Rash, what do you mean he was Makadish of Basula? His Kedushin is only Chal B'Gmar Biyah. She's already Ba'ula. The answer must be that his Kedushin is not Chal. And I'm sorry, his Kedushin is Chal already with Chilas Biyah. If she's already Mekudeshes, then he's living with his wife. And that's okay. A Kohen Gadol is allowed to live with his wife who's a And now we get to Akasha, the Avnei. Now the Avnei Maluf is known by a different popular name. Anybody know who he was? Like, he wrote a different book that's very famous on Choshen Mishpat, called the Ketzos. Have you ever heard of the Ketzos HaChoshen? I'm telling you, if you had to enumerate all the books of the Achronim on Choshen Mishpat, this book would be on top of the list. And the same author wrote a work on Even HaEzer, laws of marriage. It's called the Avnei Maluf. Alokainalon la'alocha, shebias shogeg v'ones, eino kona v'almona min ha'irisim legam, elarak la'sosa arus. So what is this Lamed Chesed? I'm just curious. It says here in the note, Nechleku b'davar Rav Shmuel Halon Nun Vav Lishnikama Nechal Almona min Asui. Yeah, but he's talking about an Almona min Iris. Via Grua Omed Hayom Tats. All right, this is it's. I just want to see if we can cut to the chase for our purpose. I knew the rest is not this up. 1 minute iris. The album also be so there's a phrase here called Dvarim Aksuvim Parsha, which I think is a reference to Nachal. When Almonim and Suin, and Rav holds that even a beer group made a Yom Tafas Pafu, he can sue us. Shmuel in a Koda Litvorium. Aksubim with Parsha, Dailo Rishis Nafas Ochim. That's a case of what Almonim in a Su. Avo be Almonim. You know, Eris in Lialma in a Konos be a Grua, Wormax. Kaimel and Kalafa. That what is this bia grua? That's a bia shogeg the onus. Eina kona the almana, iris and legam. So it's only kona varim haksumim b'parish, which has to do with naf. L'rakla sosa arusa. Ein dinakin sua lechel b'truma. Oh, I see. Well, let's say he is a Kohen and she's a Bas Yisrael. Can she eat from Truma? The answer is eat from Truma. V'litamela nidoreh. So she doesn't have the status of Achilas Truma. She's married to a Kohen, and he will not bury her or be Mefer Hanudar. we're talking about a Yevamot now, all right? I don't get it. He's ona habitchilas beer. Maybe that's what he's going to ask. Let's just see. If Ken Hadri kuchu leduch halo af im yibum ona bitchilas beer. Let me grant you your premise that yibum is different than kiddushin, and he's kona bitchilas beer. As we said before, Elo kibia grua. We should say that if he doesn't have das, then it's bia grua, ogegar onus. Ena nasis elo arusaso bulvad v'imken ech utar gadol ligmar spiosale koin gadol koli v'nesuim lo be'ers nachish nasis be'ula v'nesuim nachalam dak. Okay, let's see. Rabosai, can you work with me? I want to put together two premises, which the Avnei Malum derives from a sugya later on in Yevamos on Daf Nun Vav. Okay. Premise number one is that when we differentiate between Erisin and Nisuin, just 1 second, and we say that Boel Daital Gmarbi, which means that she becomes a Nesua with Gmarbi. How do we see that? Because the Gemara Daf Nun Vav says that if an Almona Minha Erisin falls for Yibum, right, falls for Yibum. So if he what? If he has a Bia Grua, we'll explain that in a minute, right? So then she remains an Arusa. In other words, Ruvain died. His wife was only an Arusa. When Shimon does a Bia Grua as Yibum, he simply duplicates, like a mirror image, of the status of the issues of his brother Reuven. Now, a Tchilas Bia situation is equal to a Bia Grua. So therefore, her status after Tchilas Bia would be that of an Arus. In other words, Tchilas Bia is not a full-fledged kedusha because called boel daito admar, but within the context of Yibum to recreate the issues that existed between Sarah and Reuven, now between Sarah and Shimon. For that, Tchilas Bia is enough. The Torah recognizes Tchilas Bia, but the Kinyan is always going to be a spin-off or a mirror image of the original Kinyan. So if she was an Almona Min Ha'eretzin, then until he does what would constitute in Gedushin, a full-fledged Gedushin, which is Marbia, then all he has is that Kiddush of the Torah that Yibum could now take the original Zika to Reuven and shift it over to Shimon the Yavam. But since that original Zika was a Zika of Erison, now Shimon only has Erison. Okay, that's premise number one. Now, just on the side, like a footnote, why is Tchilas Bia called Bia Gerua? What is Bia Gerua? And the answer is that Bia Gerua is a Bia without das, which means classic would be Shogeg or Onus. Let's say he was forced, he was compelled. That Bia, which is lacking das, is called a Bia Gerua. And that Bia would not qualify to create Ichus in general, but in Yibum, the Torah says, we don't need his das. And therefore, it works as this unique kinyan of Yibum, which is a kinyan that duplicates the original kinyan to the Ach Shemes. And therefore, let's say Reuven and Shimon, the two brothers, are Kohanim, and Reuven was Makadesh Sarah, but she's only Erison. She doesn't eat from Truma. And if she dies, he doesn't violate his Kedushas Kuna by burying. He doesn't have the power to single-handedly negate her Nidarim. So that's called Erison. And that Erison now is duplicated by the Bia of Yibum. If the Bia of Yibum is a Bia Grua, which means it's a Bia minus Das. If he has Das, then he's being Makadisha, and she's a full-fledged Jesus Sleeves. And that exists on its own, independent of the original Ishus. That has nothing to do with Zikas Ishus. That's a brand new Ishus that he's creating now. But in the case of Onetz or Shogeg, where we're minus the Das, then it could only be a Bia of Yibum. It can't be a Bia of Kedusha. So a Bia of Yibum minus stripped of its dimension of Kedusha would only be effective to duplicate the original Ishus to Reuven, and now, clone it onto Shimon. Okay, now let's get to Tchilas Bia. Tchilas Bia fits into the exact category of description of Bia Gerua. Why? Because just like in Bia Gerua, it only has the status of Bia as far as Yibum is concerned, but not Kedushin, because we're lacking Das. So too, Tchilas Bia doesn't have the ability to create Kedushin, because in Kedushin we say, Kolabol Daito Al Gemar Bia. So it's only a Bia because it's a Maisa Bia within the context of Yibum. And therefore would only have the ability to give her the status of an Arusa if Reuven's marriage relationship to Sarah was that of Erison without Nesud. That's premise number one. Now we get to premise number two. The premise number two is a little bit easier. And that is that in the case of a Kohen Gadol who's enjoined from marrying a Ba'ula, his Isur is in Nisuin and not in Eris. Right? The Torah did not slap down a lav on the Kohen Gadol if he only did Eris. He can still do tshuva, so to speak, and give her a divorce. When does he cross the red line and violate the Isur of Lo Yikach? That's with Kiddushin Gemurah and a full-fledged Ishus of Nisuin. If we would, stop the movie, midway between Eris and Nisuin, he could do tshuva and he could divorce him. The Isur here that addresses Ki Lo Yikach Almana is Nisuin. So now let's get back to our case. We have an Almana min Erison that fell for Yibum to the Kohen Gadol. The Shimon was the Kohen Gadol. Now we're going to have a serious problem. The Gemara says that Esei Dochalosas in this case because she's still a Psula. But no, what happens? We get to the end of Tchilas Bia, that's where we are now. And at this point, what kind of an Ichus does he have? He only has the issues of Yibum. Why? Because in Kiddushin it's called a Bo'ol Daiton Gmarbi. So at that moment in time, if we were freeze that moment in space, our status is that of an Arusa. The Kohen Gadol is enjoined from the Su'id with a Ba'ul. And she became a Ba'ul at that very same second. So two things happened at that second of the end of Tchilas Bir. Number one, she became an Arusa, because again, we're going to duplicate the Ishus of the late brother Reuven, which was only Almana Mina Erisin. So at that point, she is now an Arusa. But a second thing happens at that point. She is now a Ba'ula, because Tchilas Bia is enough to change her status from that of Basula to that of Ba'ula. So if that be the case in Hilchas Yibum, he has fulfilled his mitzvah of Yibum with Tchilas Bia. Now he goes ahead and plows forward with Sof Bia. At that moment in time, he is violating the Isser of Ba'ula, and we can't apply Esei Dochalosis, because at that moment in time, he's moving from Erison to the Stuart, which is exactly the Isser. That's the Avnei movement. So the number of answers to this question, but I don't know, we'll just take a quick stab at the Imrei Moshe. He says, "She'ein iser ba'ula chal al iser almana." She'ein iser chal al iser v'ein asur alav el b'lav shel almana. V'mashe kol almana min asur and asur mishum shnei shemos shel almana v'ula hu mishum shekol zman she tachas baila ein chal alav iser ba'ula l'fi she'ein iser zeh chal iser shesish. Uvamisas baila chalu aleshne isur b'masachas. Abal monim in an erisin. Me'acha shechal aleha b'misas abal isur almona sulo chal aleha v'tchilas bia isur. Wow. Okay. Rabbi say the truth is that this is dazzling, absolutely stunning, but I don't like it. Why don't I like it? Because it's not fundamental. It's more technical. Yeah, I was hoping that we would answer this question with a breakthrough, but it's very dazzling, very impressive. He says the following: we have a principle called Eini Sachal Lis. And in this case, you cannot add an Isur Ba'ula on top of a pre-existing Isur Almana. So that unless the two Isurim emerge simultaneously, that's called B'vasachas, then if the Isur Almana is Chal at time T1, there's no room for the Isur Ba'ula to be Chal at time T2. So if you'll ask me, so when do we have a reality of a Metzius of a Losasa with an Essen? Right? So the answer is b'vas achas, when in a case where, just 1 second, where she's a ba'ula under Reuven, now Reuven dies. The moment that Reuven dies, she becomes asura l'kohen gadol in a double iser simultaneously. She's now an almana, and she's a ba'ula. But in the case of Almana Mina Erisin, when he dies and she was only an Arusa, not a ba'ula, she at that moment became Asura l'kohen gadol midin Almana. She can never ever become Asura midin ba'ula because Eini Sachal Alis. So you're telling me the Avnei Malud that if we frame that moment of Gemar Tchilas Bia, so at that point, he's going to now, by completing his bia, violate not only Nisuin with an almana, but also Nisuin with a ba'ula, because she became a ba'ula. But the answer is she doesn't become a ba'ula, as far as the Yisur Torah is concerned. Why? Because of Ein Isur Chalalis, she's already an almana. So when he first started his bia, she was already an almana. Again, for the sake of Esed Dochalosa, we're going to allow him to begin the bila. But now the Avnei Malum says, well, how can we allow him to complete his bia at this point? There's not only a losa set, but there's also an essay because she became a ba'ula midway after he finished the tchilas bia. The answer is the Isur ba'ula, says the Yemei Moshe, will not be chal on the Isur almana because the principle of Isur almana. It's only a case of almana and asurin where both isurim of almana and ba'ula chal b'vasachas is very interesting. He's assuming that when Reuven marries a woman, that doesn't generate an Isur on the Kohen Gadol. It's only when Reuven dies and she becomes an almana. Yeah, you understand? There's a paradox over here because the very moment he marries her, she's an Eshes Ish, we already have built into the script that she'll be an almana. I mean, if you want to talk about the Kohen Gadol marrying her, she's an Eshes Ish, she can't marry her. He's only going to be able to marry her after he dies. So you could say, but it's against the Yemei Moshe, that already at the moment that he married her, even before she became a ba'ula, and he didn't consummate the marriage, she's already considered an almana as far as the Kohen Gadol is concerned. But name, this reminds me, once had a sugya of whether tchilas yibum or self yibum. You remember with that sugya? But in any event, that's the answer of the Yemei Moshe. So what I'd like to do now, we only have a few minutes left, but just introduce the next sugya. So that was our journey through the Alkut HaMiyut. I have to tell you that initially when I opened up the Alkut HaMiyut, I was looking for a discussion about Esed Dochalosa, but so far I didn't find it. Am I missing it? I don't know how we could have skipped that sugya. I'm going to continue looking for because that's the sugya that really captures my mind. So now on the bottom of Daf Chaf Amid Beis, Itmar, 2 lines up before the bottom. Bias Kohen Gadol Bi'almana. So Reuven was married to Sarah and he died without children, and Sarah now falls for Yibum to Shimon, who's a Kohen Gadol. And now the Kohen Gadol has implemented Yibum. Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Machlokes Had Omar, according to one opinion, is Eina Poteres Soros. You remember again, let's just review that we have a principle that we've been operating with here in the second paragraph of Yevamos, that if the Torah prohibits the Yibum, then that is not considered a bias Yibum. And in this case, an almana, which is always Yibum, is an almana, fell to Shimon, who's a Kohen Gadol, and he actually went ahead and implemented Yibum. That Yibum is not a Maaseh Yibum because it's totally invalid. The Torah prohibited that Yibum. And of course, we're talking about an almana min anisuin, so ein esei dochalo sevi esei, she's already a ba'ula. But Chad Omar poteres tzarasa. So the Gemara corrects Burzon on the top of Chafal. Almana min anisuin kuliyam lo pligi lo pacha dein esei dochalo sevi esei ki pligi almana min ha'erisin. Mandiom poteres osi ese vidochias losa. Se mandiom ena poteres osi ese lo vidosa came the after b'chalutz. I read that fast, but did you catch it? I only read it fast because it's very simple. One of the few Gemaras in Yevamos that you never hear me say about a Gemara in Yevamos that is simple, except for this one. Nothing in Yevamos is simple. But this one is simple. The Gemara is pointing out that if she already had the suin with the late brother Reuven, then she's now not only an almana, but she's also a ba'ula. And then we have the principle called ein esi tochlos aviyesa. And going with that line, we understand very well the first opinion here. I don't think we know who it is, but Chad Omar Eina Poteres, whether it's Rav Yochanan or Blaso, whoever it is, because it's a Maisa beer which the Torah prohibited, and therefore we don't recognize it and validate it as a kiyum of yibum. It doesn't register at all on the Richter scale. And then after meaning is going to be she has a tzara, because Reuven was married also to Rivka, and Rivka now needs yibum or chalitza. The other man, the Omer says, no. The prohibition of almana l'kohen gadol in a yibum situation is only d'rabbanan. It's a gzeira d'rabbanan, because on a deraisa level we're going to apply esei dochalos. So what's the machlokas? Machlokas really hinges on whether esei dochalos could apply in a case where you have the option of chalitza, because it's efshel l'kayim shneim. You can be makayim the mitzvah of yibum through chalitza, and at the same time circumvent violating the Isser of the lav of Alman Kam. Again, in a case of Almanim in a Nesuin, then no one would allow for that beer to have the status of a beer that would pater up the tzara, because that surely is a beer Isser. In the case of Almanim in Erisin, that's where we should apply the principle of essay docha lo saseh, because there's no essay. She's still a basula. And then we'd have to say that almana mina erisin is asura b'yibum b'rabbanan. On a deraisa level, there is yibum, and therefore the beer would. But the answer is that it's efshel l'kayim shneim. That even though it's only an essay and a lo saseh in the case of erisin, but nevertheless, we cannot apply the principle of esei dochalos aseh because of the option of chalitz. Good?
So one has gone through Nisuin, the other one has gone through Rusin.
Right. In the case of she went through Nisuin, everybody agrees that the bia is meaning.
Now you got one of each. The one who went.
What do you mean by one of each?
One wife went through Nisuin.
Okay. He had two wives. Reuven was married to both Sarah and Rivka. So which one?
So Sarah went through Nisuin and Rivka went through Rusin. Sarah pater Rivka then?
No, absolutely not. Because that's not a bias yibum. The Torah is totally opposed to that bias. So you're gonna have hafkanot in the middle of Yerushalayim. You know. How could he have done that beer? That beer is totally prohibited by the Torah, and therefore it has no validity whatsoever.
Right. But okay. But
now let's keep this set, because it's only chayvi lav and esei dochalos. We're talking about. Wait a minute. 1 second. No, because what did you just say to me?
I'm thinking. I mean, isn't Sarah an Arava to the Kohen Gadol?
No, I wouldn't call it an Arava. She's prohibited to the Kohen Gadol to the extent that she blocks the possibility of applying esei dochalos, because she's an almanim and a nesuin, and therefore she's also, in addition to the losa, says she's got an essay of.
It doesn't. So she doesn't remain Ashes at that point to be a.
Oh, that's an excellent question. Yeah, I would assume she's an Ashes, but I think the next sugya is going to pick that up.
Because then I would think she would put her. She's an Arava for Ashes Act. Put her son.
Oh. Wait a minute. Let me go slowly. Only because my mind got caught with something else. What happens to the opposite situation? So let's say he had beer with what we call a Rivka, and Rivka was an almanim in Eris. Okay. So then I think for sure Sarah would go free without chalitza. Even though normally chayvin lav would require chalitza, she would not require chalitza because he was mekayim the mitzvah of yibum vis-a-vis Reuven, meaning vis-a-vis the bias. Okay. Now you're asking another question. Why is the Gemara clearing here? 1 second. Yeah, no, it's no problem. The Gemara is not addressing your case. The Gemara is talking about a classic case of Reuven married Minha. In other words, a full-fledged marriage with Reuven, and then he died, and she falls to even for Shimon. You're right, she becomes an Eish Isaac. Why? Because since there's a Los Haseh and an essay, in a case of Almanim and Asu, the essay, don't Los of the essay, now she's added the Parsha of Yibum, and she's an Eish Isaac. Hatzara would not be Misyaberes. But in that very strange, what word am I using? Formulation, whatever the word is, where he has two wives, one has been an Eris and one's a Suin, then you're right. Then for sure, even the one in Eris does not need Yibum or Chalitza because she's a Tzaras Erev. That's, I think, a very fair assumption. Because again, by definition, what's matir the Erev of Eish Isaac? It's got to be the mitzvah of Yibum. If there's no mitzvah of Yibum, then you're back to square one, and there's an Isser of Eish Isaac. I'm just curious, in the since we gave out the Alkut Biurim here, you have page K, right? Yes. Is there any discussion here on page K? No, I don't see. Oh, so I'm just going to read to you your questions on page 12, if you don't have. Okay. Mitch is going to have them. Yay, Mitch. You're going to have them. Sorry. Yo, okay. I'm rooting for him because, So the next discussion on Vav, I'm just going to read to you the black, they have the dark lines for the Koteret. He says, in Yesh Kares Shal Eishes Ach, Bechayve Lav V'Yes. When it's a Chayve Lav V'Yes, you can't apply the principle of Esei Dochalosa because the essay is there an error of Chayve Lav. And I'm pretty sure he's going to assume that there is such an error. Over that, we never see. We could see. So I don't know if you have any time to photocopy maybe 1 or 2 more pages here in the Alkut Biurim, because that can thrust us down a different path. And let's make a note of where we got to here on Chaf Aleph. We're up to Masechet, am I correct? Okay, that's tomorrow's what day of the week? Wednesday. All day. I'm just going to leave us here. If you have time, if you're interested, you'll make it. Okay, now we do our Hakdama to Chachim. Shut this down here.
I'm just going to put on. Oh.